Hey there, how you doing? I hope you've been having a good reading month and been able to concentrate on some good books recently. Personally, I feel like I've had quite a chaotic reading month. There's been like a number of things that have just been intruding upon my reading life, and meaning that I haven't been able to concentrate or do as much reading as I ideally wanted to, although I have read quite a lot of things. So I'm going to get into what I read over the month of September. But I'd really love to know about both what you've been reading recently and really enjoying, or maybe not enjoying so much, but also like how your reading life has been going recently. Have you had the same thing at all about being distracted from what you've been able to read? I feel like even when I do sit down to read, sometimes recently I've had a number of like work things going on, and so that's been like half on my mind while I've been reading something, which means I haven't been able to fully concentrate on the books I've been reading. But also, I had a period earlier this month where I had a bad cold. I mean, it wasn't COVID. I had a number of tests, and so yeah, thankfully it wasn't that. But yeah, that did sort of knock me out for like almost over a week, and meant that I really couldn't concentrate on what I wanted to read. And then when I was over the cold, then I went on holiday, which was wonderful and really nice. But also meant that even though I took a big stack of books with me to read on my holiday, as I do, like always excitedly planning what I'm going to read on the holiday, but then when I'm actually on the holiday, I'm there with my partner and I'm doing sort of holiday things, and so don't have as much time to just sit down and read as I probably normally do in my normal week. And so that was slightly distracting as well. But I mean, it's all these life things happen, and it means that you don't always get to read as much as you want to, or in such a concentrated way as you would ideally like to. But yeah, that's just been my past month. But I do have a lot of books that I want to talk about and that I've been getting to, and I do realize that this is more than people normally read, or the average person normally reads. But yeah, I did have one DNF this month, which I'll talk about and why I stopped reading it. But then yeah, a number of books that I'd sort of like started and so finished, and a number of books which I'm currently reading. And so yeah, I'll talk about all of that. I think first I will talk about a couple of books which I read specifically for the Wainwright Prize, and just because I was really interested to read some more environmental nonfiction. And also, I don't often talk about nonfiction books on my channel, and so I think it's nice to talk about that and focus on that a bit. And so I read A Life on Our Planet by David Attenborough, which I absolutely adore David Attenborough, and an enthusiastic fan of all of his nature programs. And it's really fascinating hearing his wisdom and his experience of his incredible life story of creating nature programs, and how he got into it, and his experience first going to these far off places and really environments which a lot of people hadn't seen before, and being able to cover that. And it's really fascinating getting that story and that perspective, and also how he realized, like, going into these environments which he sort of assumed have been the same for hundreds of years, and then realizing that these are places which are rapidly changing, and he's experiencing these places and seeing creatures which are becoming extinct, and seeing landscapes which are rapidly changing because of climate change. And the message of this book is that's what he's really experienced, and how there are urgent things which are occurring in the environment which we need to pay attention to, and which is a message that you will realize before going into this book. And then he gets into a lot of the details of it and puts it across in a really meaningful way, and shows a lot of practical steps that governments can take to make these changes, and have more awareness of this, and what needs to occur. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of David Attenborough. I think he's incredible and amazing. Though one thing I sort of found when reading this is that he is writing from a perspective of privilege. Like he's an incredibly prominent figure, and he has sort of connections to figures both in politics and very prominent, the best scientific minds in the world, to sort of verify his facts and to get more information about it. And I think it's great how he does that and is able to concisely talk about these issues and real practical steps that need to be taken. But it's a slightly different reading experience from, I guess, just like reading a book by a scientist who may not have access to all of these things and has just sort of gone out there in a pioneering way to research them completely on their own, whereas David Attenborough has all these big connections, and that's not to criticize David Attenborough, that's just to say that it's a slightly different reading experience from a figure like that. But of course what drew me to reading this book is that it is David Attenborough, and wanting to know more about his life and his thoughts and reflections about all of these things, because he's someone who is in his mid-90s and has really experienced a big change in the world over time. So yeah, this was a great reading experience, really inspiring, not just sort of depressing in the way of a lot of articles and think pieces about the environment can be, because it seems so bleak, but he sees that there can be real practical steps that are taken. And I also read I Belong Here by Anita Sethi, who's a writer and journalist, and who, if you watch my video about going to the Women's Prize ceremony this year, I got a chance to talk with her a little bit, and I also talked to her at the Wainwright Prize ceremony when it occurred, and this is her story, her personal story about having a racist encounter on a train journey in England, and a man who basically accused her of or told her to go back to where she comes from, but she comes from Northern England, and that's where she was born and bred, and but because she looks different from white people and has brown skin, some racist individual that she encountered on this train focused on her and decided to attack her in this way, and she recorded this and posted it on Twitter, and it became a big viral thing. And because of the evidence she recorded and testimonies that were given, this man was convicted of a crime, which is great that this was recognized as a criminal activity, and that he was convicted in this way. But I think we can just sort of say or naturally assume that man was racist, and you shouldn't take seriously anything he says. But obviously this has real personal ramifications and an emotional and psychological impact on the victim of the crime, Anita, her experiences with this, and it's much different experience personally dealing with this rather than just intellectually saying oh, you shouldn't take into account that isn't the popular perspective of people generally in England, and so her way of dealing with this was to go on a physical journey through England, to walk a well-known nature path, which is quite difficult and grueling one that she went on, going through the country and really physically re-experiencing the country as a way of both reclaiming this is the land that I come from and I belong here, but also to emotionally deal with this and psychologically deal with this experience and sort of work through all of the many issues that are involved in the attack that she experienced, and it's really meaningful and moving how she goes through the ramifications of this, that it's not just being somewhere that you were born and being accused of not belonging there, but it's also the impact of when an experience like this occurs, people around you not speaking up and defending you, and that has an impact as well, and I think it's a really timely message, and that something we all need to be aware of, that when we're out in public spaces and we see an injustice like this occurring, that we should speak up about it. And that's something I definitely know I should be aware of as well, because I think it's partly an issue of just sort of walking around and being in your own mind, and if you're suddenly confronted with an incident, and you almost have to like psychologically readjust to like, oh wait, what is going on here, and how can I intervene? But also it's like having the bravery of taking a step and saying and speaking up, and because it's sort of easier to just not be involved and say, oh, that's an incident occurring, like I don't want to get involved in that, but to it's, I think, all of our duties to like to speak up and say something and like that, and and that's something I struggle with, and I think I need to be more aware of as well. But also, yeah, how she goes through all of the stages of like looking at the impact of the way language is used, and reflecting on the way that the natural environment is really a part of us, like the landscape around us is a part of who we are, and how we construct our sense of identity, and I think it's really meaningful how she writes about that in this book. And there are some parts which I think are slightly sentimental in the way she talks about the natural world, and there are some sections which are, I think, slightly repetitious, but like overall I think it's a really successful and really meaningful book, and so I was really glad to read this. One of my favorite new novels that I read this month is The Wrong End of the Telescope by Rabih Alameddine, and this is a story of a Lebanese doctor named Mina, who is a trans woman that goes to the island of Lesbos because a friend of hers is working there with an organization assisting refugees who are arriving on the island amidst their transit to go into different European locations. And Mina is in a long-term relationship with a woman in America, and has been living in America for many years, ever since she was sort of rejected by the majority of her family, although she has had a close relationship with her brother, and she reconnects with her brother while on this island because he's physically close to her, so he travels there to meet her, and so they sort of reconnect amidst this journey when she starts working with refugees. And you could say that this is a novel about many social issues that are current, being talked about today, and but the way the author handles this in this book is so engaging and fun, and it's a very human book. The way he presents these characters and talks about how they're dealing with all their issues while trying to be good people and assist other people dealing with their issues, because in addition to the story of Mina, we get the story of a Syrian woman that arrives on this island and is experiencing a terminal illness, and while trying to travel with her family to another location, they've had to leave Syria because of a number of conflicts and issues involved in their lives, and the way, yeah, he presents these stories, but also a number of other characters that Mina meets along the way and encounters is so creative and engaging, and really just tells their story on this very human level in a way that I really connected with and enjoyed. I felt like, this isn't a novel I just sort of reading out of sort of like social responsibility because of the issues it talks about, but is really engaging and enjoyable, but not in a sort of way such as like I sort of like compared this novel to American Dirt in that this is a much more successful novel than that, whereas I think American Dirt in Jenny Cummins' novel sort of handles plot in a way that is more, it's like more about the plot than it is so much about the issues that are involved. The issues are just sort of like laid on top of this somewhat generic plot in that novel, whereas in this book there is a plot to it, but it's much more about the individual stories and the human lives that are all involved in their many complexities, and I think the author just handles this in such a good way, and also like is sort of like questioning himself, because the author himself is a character in this, and part of the story is that Mina is speaking directly to the author, who also travels to this island and is also dealing with his own issues. And I think that is such a creative way of handling this issue of like of raising all of these social issues, but not in a sort of like self-righteous way, but and acknowledging his own sort of involvement in the story, but also just sort of making himself this side character in amidst the story. And yeah, I thought that was so creatively done, and so I found it a really inspiring and wonderful reading experience, as well as a really meaningful one. I also extremely enjoyed Elif Shafak's new novel, The Island of Missing Trees, which again is like such a creative novel, because she's someone that also writes a lot about social and political issues, and in this case she's dealing specifically with the recent history of Cyprus and the war there between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, and deals with that through a love story of a Turkish woman and a Greek man who were born and raised in Cyprus, and find themselves in their late teenage years in the midst of their romance. Their world is torn apart because of the conflict, the larger conflict in the country. And then the story goes to many years later, when a daughter of theirs living in England is trying to understand her parents' past, and can't really appreciate, like she understands the overall conflicts, but there's a lot of nuance and intricacies to their stories, which she has to gradually learn over time through her experiences speaking with her aunt and her father, and dealing with that conflict, and so like you could say that it's a fairly like obvious device to use a love story to explore the history of this political conflict, but the way she tells this story, I think, is so detailed and meaningful when she gets into the intricacies of the story and the past of this couple, which is gradually revealed over the course of the story in quite a suspenseful way, that kept me really engaged. But also an incredibly inventive part of this story is it's partly narrated from the point of view of a fig tree, and so you get a fig tree's point of view on the history of this story, because this couple used to meet regularly in this taverna in Cyprus, and in the middle of this taverna was a fig tree, and so the fig tree sort of experienced their romance, but then continues to experience that story because a clipping from that fig tree is taken to England and then grown in England, and so there's a bookmark in this because my partner is currently reading this novel himself, and I sort of pressed it upon him because I said, oh, you have to read this novel because it's partly narrated from the point of view of a fig tree, and he loves figs, and actually we both love figs a lot, and so much so that I'm gonna reveal probably a very personal detail, which I shouldn't reveal, but I don't think my partner watches my videos, so he probably won't know this, but my partner and I have a fictional child that we invented many years ago called Fig Bufala, because we both love figs and we both love Bufala cheese, and so we came up with this fictional child, Fig Bufala, which is just sort of this playful thing that we refer to every once in a while. But anyway, that's a very silly thing and a little tangent going on talking about this book. But yeah, I love that the book, the story is partly narrated from the point of view of a fig tree, because it's very playful and fun, and I think the author sort of acknowledges that in creating this narrative, but also it gives a very different point of view outside of this political and like human conflicts, because it's from the point of view of a non-human who experiences time and the world and the natural world around her in a very different way from humans do, and so that gives a very different perspective, which is fun, but also, yeah, as a way of commenting on the environment and changes to the environment and how there's been environmental impact as well as a human one because of these political conflicts in Cyprus, and so yeah, I think this is so creative and well done. It's such an engaging story, and I just enjoyed it so much. Of course, I also read Beautiful World, Where Are You?, Sally Rooney's new novel, which so many people have been talking about. There's been so many videos and hot takes on this that I don't know, is there more to say about it? But actually, I would say there is more to say about it, because even though I made a whole separate video about it, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it has like stuck with me, and I've continued to think about its plot and its characters, and in a number of ways. So yeah, it is a novel that's really sticking with me, even though I read it like 4 weeks ago, and I've been reading other books since then. But yeah, I like especially been thinking more about the character of Alex and her relationship with Felix. And one of the things I was really struggling with when I was reading this is like, why is Alice so attracted to Felix? Because I feel like Felix, like not because he's like in a different class from her, he works in a warehouse and she's this famous wealthy novelist, but because he's like a bit of a dick to her, and why like he does a lot of dickish things, and you would think that would put Alice off, but she sticks with them and even like says that she loves him, and that's something I've been sort of puzzling about and like wondering like, why is she so attracted to him and continues to be attracted to him. And there's a number of reasons that I can logically think of for that. For instance, that he's someone that it isn't sort of overawed by her success, and I think it's so interesting how her success is something she kind of shrugs off and says like, oh well, it's just sort of an accident, and or at least that's the kind of attitude she exudes, but actually it's a real point of pride for her. And when the big conflicts come towards the end of the novel, when all of the 4 major characters come together, I think it's really interesting how that plays out, and how it sort of comes out that really this is a big point of her ego that she holds very close to her, and she actually looks down on other people who haven't had the same amount of success that she has. And I think it's really interesting how that all plays out. So yeah, there's a lot more to say about this book, especially I was especially thinking about this when I read the classic novel Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence recently, and I just finished this, and so it's a book that I'm still pondering and thinking about a lot, and it's actually like, it's often noted how Sally Rooney is she a modern day Jane Austen, whereas I would say like she's more, I mean, I actually haven't read any Jane Austen or fully read any Jane Austen books, and I know that's a point of shame, and a lot of readers will criticize me for not reading much Jane Austen, but yeah, I've just never really got along with her writing before, and I keep wanting to go back and try her again. But anyway, I would say that that Sally Rooney is more like a modern day D.H. Lawrence in the way that she writes about class and also romantic relation and sexual relationships with each other, at least based on reading Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is the first full novel I've read by D.H. Lawrence before. I've read some of his fiction before, but I haven't read an entire novel. And so this novel really surprised me in some ways. It's a much more thoughtful book than I thought it would be, I think because of the sort of scandal surrounding it, and the obscenity trials that this novel experienced. I was just sort of, I guess, almost more expecting that there would be more like constant sex in it. There is a lot of sex in it, although the major explicit sexual content of it comes quite late in the book. I think probably 2/3 of the way through the book. I mean, there's some before then, but the real heavy sexual parts of it only come in much later. And yeah, and so I found it really interesting following how the story of Lady Chatterley and her aristocratic husband, who is in a wheelchair and so isn't physically able to either have a child or to have relations with his wife in the way that she would ideally like. And so she takes not just one lover, but she has multiple lovers. And it's really interesting. The early on in the book, she has an affair with an Irish writer who it's quite like a passionate affair, but then there are conflicts which come into it. And I think it's so interesting how they sort of confront each other about this, and how she basically like blatantly says to him like you don't care about my pleasure, do you? And is sort of continuously asking him about this, wanting him to admit that, and he almost like doesn't want to say it because he doesn't even realize that isn't a consideration that he should be having. And I think it's really interesting how the story handles that. But then when getting into the affair that she has with a working class man that works on the property as a gamekeeper, and how he has a much more complicated past than the aristocratic husband gives him credit for, and probably that she gives him credit for, until she starts having a very intimate relationship with him. And yeah, I just really enjoyed the levels of how that played out. But there are some bits of it which are slightly sensationalized, which when getting into the actual relations that they have with each other and the conversations they have, in a way I think that's liberating and freeing, like talking about these issues to do with sensuality and sex in a very open way. I thought that was like bold on one level, but then on the other level I thought, oh, it is like a bit squeamish. And when like he explains to her the meaning of the C word, and when they give each other, you know, pet names for each other's genitals and like and when it gets into all of that, it does feel quite slightly silly. And yeah, and it's interesting, the question of like well, is this a novel that's kind of feminist in showing that she becomes like sexually liberated over the course of the novel and discovers herself as a person, or is it a different kind of confinement? And one of the exciting things about reading classic literature as opposed to new novels, where you only have a limited number of views of other people who happen to have read this new book with you at the time that it's being published, there is a huge amount of criticism and thoughts and opinions about this book that have come out since its initial publication. And I think it was first published in the UK in its real full form in the 1960s. And so yeah, I've been really interested and excited to go read some more criticism about it since then. And of course, one of the first sources I went to was Joyce Carol Oates, who wrote an essay partly about this novel in her collection called The Profane Art, which was published in the early 80s. And so she has an essay called At Least I Have Made a Woman of Her, Images of Women in Yeats, Lawrence, and Faulkner. And so she does specifically reference Lady Chatterley's lover in this, and how she sees that Lady Chatterley is basically brought into a different kind of confinement than the one she was in before. And that's sort of her perspective on this. I think because she sees the character of the gamekeeper in this novel basically as a cipher for D.H. Lawrence himself. And something I would sort of say to that is he is a character in this, and I don't know how much you can take his character as directly sort of spouting D.H. Lawrence's thoughts, which I'm sure you can to some degree, and because his thoughts and his opinion and his dialogue comes to dominate so much of the latter part of this novel, you probably could say that, but he is still a character, and that's a slightly tricky thing with fiction. I think it's probably not right to assume that because there are characters which do criticize this gamekeeper's opinions, that D.H. Lawrence is presenting a slightly more well-rounded view of this, but maybe that's giving Dage Lawrence too much credit. I don't know, but it's interesting to think about, and it's interesting to think about other influences because, as a recent article pointed out recently, Dage Lawrence has been surprisingly influential in a lot of new fiction this year, both in Rachel Cusk's new novel, Second Place, which I had a lot of critical opinions of, but it actually was really interesting thinking back on this novel, having read this, because a big issue I had with this novel was there's a lot of big pronouncements to do with what is man and what is woman, which is quite a simplistic view. I mean, the what makes a man and what makes a woman is I mean, there's no one thing that defines masculinity or femininity, I think, and what makes a man and what makes a woman. And I feel like Rachel Cusk was responding to D.H. Lawrence in a way in her novel, when really these are quite outdated perspectives and or conceptions, like a lot of the pronouncements of this makes me a man or this makes me a woman. I think it's just quite outdated, and so yeah, I did have some issues with that, but also I did feel slightly squeamish in that he was writing from the point of view of a woman, and there's one point where she strips off completely and looks at herself in a mirror and is very critical about her physical appearance in a way that I think isn't applied to men in the same way, when she glimpses the gamekeeper having a shower outside and he's completely naked and is just, his body is sort of idealized in a way that hers isn't. And I feel like the criticism of a woman's body is much heavily more so, even though it's quite a lot from perspective. So you could say it's well, that's just something people naturally do. They're quite critical of their own physical appearance, but that it makes me slightly squeamish reading about it from a male author's point of view, writing about a woman. And so I was slightly uncomfortable with that when reading it, but overall I found it really engaging and interesting experience, and I'm so excited to go read Alison MacLeod's new novel Tenderness, which is partly about the obscenity trials around this novel. And so it'll be another new perspective on this novel that to get, and that's just such an exciting thing about reading a classic book like this for the very first time. Now, while I was on holiday, I also started reading Joshua Ferris's new novel, A Calling for Charlie Barnes. And this was a novel I was really looking forward to because I really adored his novel To Rise Again at a Decent Hour. I thought that was an excellent book. And so this is a novel about a man who's late in his life, and he's had many marriages and multiple children, and he's sort of at a crisis point. He thinks he has cancer, and so he starts calling everyone, telling them I'm dying, I have cancer, and but then he finds out quite early on that he actually doesn't have cancer, and so sort of has to double back and reassess his life, and it's written from the point of view of one of his children, and sort of looking at his father's life, and I think that narrative perspective is slightly troublesome in a way in handling it, in handling his character and his perspective on his father, but it's mainly about how his father is having this disillusionment with the American dream, and really America's not what he sort of is all that it's cracked up to be when in the way that he was raised and the values he was raised on. And my main issue with this book and why I stopped reading it, I read about 130 pages of it, so I got a fair way through, maybe 1/3 of the way through the book, and I was mostly enjoying it, and so it sort of seems strange to give up on a book that you're mostly enjoying, but I just wasn't in love with it or so engaged with it that I wanted to carry on, because I feel like this point of view and perspective, again, is slightly old-fashioned. This kind of started to feel to me like a novel that maybe Philip Roth would have written 25 years ago, and so it's it just feels kind of strange in that way, that it's just well, of course the American dream isn't all that it's cracked up to be. I mean, I feel like that's a fairly obvious point. It's something that is still relevant, and but at the same time well, don't we know this already? And so what new perspective does this novel really have to give? And I do really enjoy his style of writing. It's slightly playful and so it's like it's not mocking the character of Charlie Barnes so much as showing his human foibles in a way which is quite charming in a lot of ways. The way he like is desperately making a lot of phone calls and is calling people that he wants to condemn and in a slightly mad way. Like it comes across as slightly crazy, but because you're so in his point of view, you understand why he's doing this, and that is sort of charming in a way, but it's not done in a way so much that I just was fully gripped by it. And there were some interesting things. He like drops narrative hints, like Charlie has very bad teeth, and so later on in the book you then realize why he has such bad teeth, and the story and reasons for that because of his past and his experiences with his mother. And I thought it was interesting how he like lays out little details like that, which you sort of find out along the way. But yeah, it just wasn't enough to engage me, make me want to keep reading it. So I decided to put this novel aside. I mean, maybe I'll go back to it at some point, but I was, because I was on holiday especially, I wanted to read a novel I was really engaged and excited by. So I picked up Matrix by Lauren Groff. And this is the story I just like totally fell into and started enjoying, because it's about a woman in 12th century France who is sort of the aristocracy, though she's sort of born into nobility, but as a bastard or a bastardess, and so isn't able to fully embody her position in the royal court, and so she's sort of cast out by the the noblewoman and a female member of the royalty to go live in a nunnery and become a nun and live alongside nuns and basically put their finances and affairs into order. And so she does this in a slightly desultory way at first, but then fully embraces that position and takes it and sees that there are advantages and to this new position she has. And so yeah, I'm still reading this, and I'm only like 50 pages into it, so there's a lot more to it. I do have some slight issues with the way she's writing it, where I feel like I'm not able to fully see the characters and some of the situations she's writing about. Like it's taking me a bit of time to like wrap my head around them, but maybe I think as I get more into the novel, maybe I'll understand that and appreciate it a lot more. But yeah, this is what I'm reading at the moment, and for the most part I'm really enjoying it, because I loved Lauren Groff's novel Fates and Furies, and this is a very different kind of novel, because it's a historical novel, like ancient history, but also yeah, in a different setting and place, and the way she's dealing with characters and lesbian experience is in a really interesting way. And so yeah, I'm enjoying this so far and looking forward to finishing it. So that's what I've been reading, that's what I've been thinking, and yeah, it feels like a slightly chaotic period. I'm hoping this next month will be slightly more even keel, and I can just sort of enjoy and fully experience the books that I'm getting into. But yeah, I'd love to know about what you've been reading, what you've been enjoying recently, and how your reading experience has been going, and how you handle dealing with those things. Do you just stop reading books when you have like other life things going on, whether it's to do with work or personal life? Yeah, how do you deal with that? Because yeah, it's something I continuously struggle with, and know like oh, am I not doing this reading experience and this book justice because I have so much else in my head at the time, or should I just carry on reading it and accept that it's going to be a slightly different reading experience, that you'll probably never have an ideal reading experience of just sitting alone and enjoying a book fully in itself without other things on your mind. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so I'm going to go off and have another cup of tea and try to wake up some more, but I hope you're doing well, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.